OnTrack is just a really simple measure of whether students are making sufficient progress in the 9th grade year to be likely to graduate in 4 years. Just a very basic indicator. But why it's important is because it's changed the way that we think about the problem of high school dropout and high school graduation.
We did this by bringing research to the table and then building systems of data that support and drive the work of the schools. Why we were successful is we said, man, you got a lot of kids in your building and it's very hard to manage them all. So let's think about identifying kids early, setting up systems within the building to use data effectively. And yeah, fixing the data problem was a big piece of it. If people don't even know what periods kids are flunking courses in, well, then they can't work on the problem. So the data took and made capable working on the problem, but it was how it was used in the building.
The thing is, at the time, graduation rates in Chicago were at about 53%. So that meant that the typical student in CPS was at risk of dropping out, right? If half the students are dropping out, it's not just the students with extremely difficult situations that are at risk. And in some schools, they had very few students who were on track in the 9th grade year. In other schools, most of their 8th grade graduates were on track in the 9th grade year. But it didn't matter how many were on track in the 9th grade year. In report after report, you look at the charts, and however many of their graduates were on track in 9th grade, that's how many they had actually graduating from high school 4 years later. And Melissa had done some research that showed that there were a lot of 8th graders that were doing fine. They entered 9th grade, all of a sudden they started to fail. So the question became, well, what's happening in the 9th grade year? And can we predict who's going to graduate by looking at the 9th grade year?
With OnTrack, you sort of get some data, you engage people in a problem, you lay some on track, and you move the train a little forward. When the principals in this city took off with OnTrack, and my network of college success went from 50 to 75% on track in 2 years, I felt like Elaine and I were standing on the track in front of a moving train saying, slow down, we don't know if this is going to work. Well, we're getting out of that way right now because it works. But the principals are taking it to the next level. There's a hunger in the school system now to say, how do we use Common Core plus this research and a focus on college to really meet the problem of college readiness for my kids?
And the prevailing logic at the time was you can't predict who's going to graduate because it's affected by so many factors and a lot of things that are happening while kids in high school, like pregnancy or incarceration or all of these problems in the neighborhood, And what we found is, actually you can predict with high accuracy whether or not students are going to graduate just by looking at how they do in their 9th grade year, whether they're coming to school, getting their work done, succeeding, right? Performing at high levels in their classes. And that's why OnTrack is so powerful, because it's a tool for actually working on the problem, right? Because schools can develop systems around monitoring attendance, monitoring students' grades, figuring out how to support students. They can't fix crime in the neighborhood and teenage pregnancy, and juvenile justice. That is outside of their realm. It's hard, but they can make sure that kids are coming to school and that they're succeeding in their classes. So it's keeping kids from falling through the cracks. I mean, without those kinds of systems, kids are doing poorly and no one reaches out, and so they end up failing, right? But once you have people reaching out, finding out why a student is failing, then they don't fall through those cracks. And so it makes it easier when you have these reports that have students clearly flagged, so you can see what's happening across all the classes. Attendance, grades, failure rates, they're all highly predictive of whether or not students graduate 4 years later. And you can use those for really much more nuanced targeting, and you can do that all the way from the beginning of the year.
What's kept me in the game is this group of principals and high school educators who became so committed to figuring out how to do this, and who made dramatic increases in on-track rates in relatively short periods of time. I watch research transform how they think on a day-to-day basis.
It was a movement that really was spread at the local level with a lot of learning happening along the way, and a lot of shifting to different shifting what schools were doing based on their own context. And I think that's what made it successful, because you could figure out how to use the data tools given the kids that you were serving, given the way that your school worked, rather than trying to have a cookie cutter policy that was imposed in the same way in all places. And I think that's how it survived all of these changes at the central office level, because it was sustained by schools really, and by people seeing that it worked and it was successful and wanting to keep doing it.
It turns out that we can reform high schools. Well, this was the idea for the Network for College Success. But for a long time, we have written off high schools, large neighborhood high schools, as institutions, the consortium call it, institutions organized for failure. For the first time, I think we've learned, it's sort of silly to say, who'd have thunk that we could have solved the dropout problem all along if we had simply stopped blaming the kids.
This is really major, right? It's not about the skills of the kids coming in. It's about whether they're successful in the 9th grade year. And this was really a game changer, not just for us and our thinking, but for a lot of high school principals. Because everyone had been working in the problem on graduation, largely in terms of tutoring and skill development. The prevailing thought was that kids just don't have the academic skills they need to succeed when they get to high school. But what we found is that a lot of students had very strong academic skills and they were still not succeeding. Here in Chicago, we feel like it's not enough to just be reaching out student by student, but you want to take a step back and look at what's happening in your school. What are the patterns, right? How have things been changing over time? Who are the students that you've been successful with? Who are the students that are still struggling?
I mean, the three things that I always find fun when I work with other cities is we don't have the data. Well, it turns out everybody has a high school transcript. Any kid at every high school in the United States gets a high school transcript. It says, here's your courses and here are your grades. And if you do that, you have an OnTrack indicator. You have the ability to say to you too. Now, building that system is really important because you first got to build the capacity of people on the ground to know why and how and to own that data in their building. Now we realize that I can change that outcome relatively early by finding that kid who is usually hiding because they don't want to tell their parents that they're skipping last period all the time, and say, it's my job as the educator to figure out how to talk to your parents because you're only 14. And there's no way you're going to turn your behavior around without somebody to help.
And this is happening at a time where we're seeing a lot of improvements in data systems and the use of early warning indicators. We've been working very closely with others who are interested in early warning indicators across the country. There are a lot of people who have been collaborating and doing research on early warning indicators and helping schools make use of early warning indicators. And I think we're seeing a new movement in schools for really using data to figure out who needs help, reach out to kids as soon as they show signs that they're struggling. So it's kind of an exciting time because I think there's a lot of potential.
We have clearly shown that this will pay off, and I expect that every city in the country should be doing it. What this reform did was to say to educators in their building, we will help you build the capacity to work on problems. And what excites me about this is they changed the trajectory for children.
The outcomes were even better than I ever could have anticipated. Because I thought, yeah, if you work on 9th grade, given the incredibly strong relationship, I did think you'd see benefits in terms of graduation, but I thought you'd see some fade out, right? That you'd get more students to be on track in 9th grade, but eventually some of those students would fall off, and so you wouldn't get that much of a benefit in terms of graduation. You get some benefit. So the fact that you have basically 100% benefit from what you would predict from the just looking at the longitudinal relationship has been really amazing and exciting. And it says to me a couple things. I mean, one, it points to really the importance of the 9th grade year and setting the stage for the rest of high school. But even more than that, it says that schools are changing the way they operate in terms of how they support students.
Solving the dropout problem is an anti-poverty solution. It is it's the highest payoff right now because the cost of dropping out is so high. But for the city, college is the middle class. College is our ability to take these kids who are working hard and begin to take them to the level that they will become the teachers, the police officers, and the infrastructure of the city moving forward.
I think it's very likely that graduation rates will reach 80% very soon, and even higher, 85%. Just because OnTrack rates have been going up so much. I mean, currently OnTrack rates are approaching 85%, and so far we've seen graduation rates really seem to follow almost exactly with the OnTrack rates of the cohorts, 3 years prior. I don't see any indication of that changing, so I'm really excited. I mean, we've gone from a system where students were as likely to drop out as graduate to a system where they're more than twice as likely to graduate than drop out, and that is really exciting. It's really exciting.